What's going on, Babylonians? It's me, Songs of Rage, back with another Outriders World Slayer video to bring to you, and today we're going to be covering one of my personal favourite builds, and that's going to be Vlad the Impaler. Now, Vlad the Impaler was one of our first builds that we actually ended up making, and I believe it was actually one of the first Devastator builds that we actually did for this channel. Now, the reason why it struck so like a special place in my heart is because Impale is such a great skill, or Impale was the skill that actually made me fall in love with Outriders. Just seeing that Impale animation for the first time in one of those trailers, it just made me know that I knew that I had from that point on that I was going to have to get this game, and it was pretty much from that point that actually encouraged me to be able to go into content creation. So if it wasn't for Impale, I don't know where we would be. We definitely wouldn't be to the place where we are currently right now. But without further ado, make sure you have dropped a like and subscribe on the channel. It really does help the channel out, and let's start build theorizing. So the first and foremost thing that we need to actually do is establish the build that we actually use. Now, the picture that you're going to be seeing up on the screen right now is basically what the build was at the time when we actually did make the build video, and I just wanted to be able to keep it consistent with the build video, just in case you actually do want to go back to be able to see how that build was made, to be able to actually take that out and obviously have a bit of a play around with it. Now, the main thing I would recommend on this is obviously taking off the two marshals items and being able to replace those with purple items that do actually give you anomaly power, but the build does more than enough to be able to obviously make up for that, so you don't feel like you have to be able to get those. If you do actually get the legendary drops for this build is more than capable to be able to run through CT15s, so therefore you can get away with using those for the meantime until you find those perfect god rolled epics, because everyone knows that the perfect god rolled epics are harder to be able to come across than legendary items in this game. So the main thing to do is get a 3-piece into the Seismic Commander set. So when it comes to this, we're using anomaly power, skills, life leech, and status power because we're going for the first 3 items. So this is going to be the helmet, the chest, and the legs. Now, when it comes to the mods on this, we are using things like Unstoppable Force and Tainted Blood. Unstoppable Force allows us to be able to get every single time we get resistance piercing, we get half of that straight back into a percentage increase into our anomaly power. And Tainted Blood is the one kind of like status kind of multiplier that's actually in this build. So the main thing to be able to do is being able to go across all the way to the end of Seismic Shifter to be able to grab that capstone to be able to get you increased damage to every single impale that you're actually planning to do. And then we've grabbed as many mods really as physically possible that actually help the build out when it comes to Impale. So how this playstyle kind of works is the idea is that you use your Endless Mass, and this Endless Mass will obviously gather enemies up in a group because Impale is a targeted ability, so if you're not looking at an enemy, it won't actually activate towards them, so it won't do any damage. So the idea is that you use your Endless Mass to be able to get all these enemies into one group, use your Gravity Leap to be able to jump in there, to be able to obviously use a little bit of momentum or as a movement skill in itself, and on top of that we're able to debuff with things like High Intensity and Despair when it comes to Endless Mass and when it comes to Gravity Leap, so therefore we're increasing how much damage those impales will actually hit for when we actually do activate the skill. Now the main rotation for this build is basically being able to use your Endless Mass, gather them up in a group, use your Gravity Leap to be able to land in there to be able to put a debuff, so you are dealing more anomaly damage to every single enemy that gets hit by that, which should be a lot considering how Endless Mass can actually grab quite a few enemies and pull them all in. And then you want to be able to do a ground slam melee. Now what this will do is actually, because of the skill points that we actually do have in the build, means that we're actually gaining resistance piercing for every single enemy that we've hit with that melee, which means that we're going to be dealing more damage. But also on top of that, because of Unstoppable Force, some of that feeds back into our anomaly power, which then increases the actual base damage of our impales when we actually do use them. So therefore that's why it's so important to be able to get that ground slam off, to be able to hit as many enemies as possible, and then roll out and then obviously use your Impale. The Impale will now hit, you can spec it to be able to hit a number of enemies, so it's not just hitting one at a time, but with this one we actually do have it so that we can hit multiple enemies and we got multiple charges before it goes into cooldown. Now, the 2 weapons that we do have on this build are obviously our standard when it comes to any kind of anomaly power build. So this will be our Funeral Pyre with Shadow Comet and Claymore Torrent, and it also includes the Anemoire with Moaning Winds and Radiation Splash. Now, obviously, those are interchangeable, well, at least the Anamwa is interchangeable, because you can actually use the shotgun for the guillotine to be able to then put Moaning Winds on that as well. So that's basically the main rotation. That's the main gist of this build, and that is basically for anyone that's hardcore that loves the Impale animation when it comes to this game. Now, like I said, this is more than capable of doing CT15s, but is it anywhere like in comparison to the meta build that's currently out there at the moment? It's not necessarily. This one, because of how many debuffs it can actually do, is probably a bit more aimed towards group play, but you know, just purely for the fact that it is able to keep up, but it's not the meta build, and I feel like this is probably where we're kind of expecting PCF and Square Enix to actually come through to be able to offer us something, to be able to make Impale a little bit more viable. It's almost become a meme in the community, even though it can do massive amount of damage. You know, I mean, in this build alone, we've already got 5 mods into Impale out of the maximum 10 that we can actually take in for the whole of our build. So you can see why you're kind of specking all or nothing into Impale when it comes to damage, and obviously if that doesn't pay off for you, then you are actually going to suffer a little bit when it comes to your runs. Now, this does lead us straight into the packs trees. Now, the packs trees for this one, when it comes to the 2 trees that we have available to us, Wrecker is primarily there for any kind of firepower build, and like having a quick look across, it's really not going to help us out in any kind of shape or form to be able to actually use this. Now, the only one that can actually be a difference to that is the Come One Come All skill, which means that kinetic skills like Gravity Leap and Endless Mass can remove effect resistance from hit elites. But to be fair, this is completely... but by the time you put the other 4 points into to be able to try and reach this, it's just not worth it. So therefore, we need to have a look into the bottom tree, which is going to be our Tectonic Shifter. Now, the first point, which is Impact Point, where our seismic and kinetic skill damage is increased by an additional 50% of our anomaly power, and bonus damage is split across all damaged enemies. Now, the main difference that we have for Impale across Earthquake, for example, when it comes to like the meta anomaly power build, or the Leap Quake, as Halfway likes to call it in the Outrider's Discord, is the fact that Earthquake can hit a massive number of enemies, because it is basically like an AoE kind of cleave ability, and because it's not targeted, it doesn't have a specific amount of enemies that it can actually hit. So this is where the bonus actually comes in for Impale in that sense, because Impale will actually now be kind of like a elite boss, or like a targeted group, kind of like massive damaging ability. And the reason why is because whereas Earthquake can have all this additional 50% of your anomaly power spread across anywhere from between, especially if you've got Earth's Legacy on it, anywhere between 1 to 10 to 15 enemies, depending on obviously the spawn locations and rotations that we actually do have going on, in, for example, into any kind of our expeditions. Impale, because it will only hit up to, it's either 3 or 4 enemies, I can't remember, I'm pretty sure it's 3, because we're only doing that, we are actually limiting the amount of enemies we can actually hit with our Impale, which means more damage or more of that anomaly power is actually going to go straight into the skill. So therefore we're actually going to see a massive jump up when it comes to actual damage, because if we take our roughly a figure, I think 170k anomaly power is definitely feasible for any kind of anomaly power build. This is before stacking anything that's obviously like activation, like Anomaly Echo or anything like that. If we take 170k and we take 50% of that, and then it increases our base damage by that, for we only have to split it across 3 enemies, for example. All of a sudden we've got 85k to split by 3, which is around about 27k-ish additional damage on top of our Impale skills, which means that it's then going to go fed through every single kind of like damage multiplier that we have. And as soon as we use things like Despair and that like Endless Mass being able to debuff, it's just going to hit so hard, it's going to hit like a truck. And I genuinely think Impact Point is going to be one of the main saving graces when it comes to the skill. Now, when it comes to the next point, it's kind of a toss-up in this one, because if we use Puncture, for example, the main reason why Puncture is so good is because it allows your skills, your seismic skills, to inflict bleed as standard, and then anomaly damage to enemies afflicted with bleed is increased by 15%. Now, the reason why this is good when it comes to the meta build is because Earthquake needs a mod to be able to inflict bleed, whereas Impale doesn't actually do that. From what I can recall, Impale does this as standard as soon as that skill actually lands. So therefore, you don't actually need this. You don't benefit from 50% of this skill. So therefore, all you're getting is an additional additional 15% damage to enemies that have already been inflicted with bleed. What you can instead go for is things like Obliteration, where it increases your anomaly power and resistance piercing by 5%, and each damaged enemy increases that bonus by 5% up to an additional 15% for 2 seconds. Now, the reason why I think this potentially could be better, and it's going to require some kind of testing as soon as we actually get access, is because while we are increasing our anomaly power and we are increasing our resistance piercing, which then also increases our anomaly power even further through Unstoppable Force, it's going to be interesting to see like if the flat 15% damage to bleed is actually more damage than if we were fully stacked up when it comes to Obliteration. So at this moment in time, it's too difficult for me to be able to say. I do like what Puncture is offering, but I also think that Obliteration is definitely up there and is definitely possible to actually take that spot, at least for the Vlad the Impaler build. Like I said, if you are planning to use Earthquake, then I would 100% say Puncture is probably going to be more worth it, but Obliteration, if you're just purely using Impale as itself, I do think potentially has the chance to be able to take that spot for you. The next one is Earth and Shell, and once again, this is damage dealt with skills is converted to shield. It doesn't really help the build, it doesn't hurt it either, it's just going to provide a little bit more survivability, and that's about it. So let's move on to the next one quite quickly. So what you can do is you can go for Upheaval and go for Multi-Strike. Now, Upheaval, enemies damaged by seismic skills become upheaved for 5 seconds, storing 15% of their damage that's been received during that time and releasing it once the effect ends. Now, I believe this 15% is going to be additional damage on top of what you already dealt with your skill to be able to trigger them to become upheaved. So therefore, things like mod damage, things like that is you know, it's going to add into this, and we're going to see a nice bunch of extra damage. So this is basically a flat 15% of additional damage coming your way. But the real one that interests me is going to be Multi-Strike. Now, 30% of your damage dealt by a seismic skill is stored and is added to your next seismic skill. This effect resets every time you release your stored damage. Now, the reason why this interests me so much is the fact that Impale already hits like a truck. And what we're doing is we're taking 30% of that damage that we've just dealt and we're adding it straight back into our next ability, which is going to be Impale, to be able to hit even harder. And I genuinely am interested to see if 30% is actually going to be what I'm expecting it to be, and that's going to be a massive increase. Now, the reason why I think this is because, like I said, if you use Impale as standard, and let's say theoretically you hit for 1,000,000 points of damage, you're taking 30% of that, which is 300k. You take that 300k, you put that onto the base damage of your next Impale, and your next Impale, because I think, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, I think it can deal around about 200k by itself, means that if theoretically that's the case, you're now seeing a skill that was doing 200k that fed into 1 million, now do over 500k, that's going to exceed the exact same bonus increase to be able to obviously hit for that. So that means we're looking at around about 1.5 mil, if that's the case. So that's around about, if the maths is correct on this, and like I said, this is going to require some testing to be able to confirm that is definitely the case, it's going to be more than 30% of what it's already saying. It means that we're potentially going to be seeing anywhere up to increases anywhere up to like 100% or something like that. Unfortunately, I haven't got the figures to hand. I haven't got anything to be able to confirm because we are just purely theoretically going off of the PAX trees, but this is something to be excited about when it comes to the skill of Impale, because every single damage that you're actually doing with your skill, we're now increasing the next skill of being able to treat. Now, unfortunately, it does mean that every other Impale is actually going to get that bonus, which means that we're going to need to have an even amount of Impale skills or cast to be able to be effective in a way. I mean, it's not terrible to actually have an odd amount, because obviously it will stay stored until the next skill comes around. So obviously you'll have, if you had 3 for example, one skill rotation would have 1 activation of Multi-Strike, and then the next one would have 2 activations of Multi-Strike. So it's not a terrible shout in that kind of sense. It's definitely still viable, but if you were to effectively use Impale or Multi-Strike to the best of its ability, you would have potentially up to 4 Impale. So I do think that Multi-Strike is definitely going to be one of the best choices to be able to go for if you are planning to use the Impale skill. Now, the other way that you can actually go with this, and I don't think it's going to be as strong, but it's going to be interesting to see how these debuffs additionally stack, is going to be Richter Rising, where enemies damaged by both seismic and kinetic skills within 4 seconds receive 30% more damage for 4 seconds. So you can use your Impale to be able to inflict a kind of like a small debuff to a bunch of enemies, but what the best way to be able to do this would be with Endless Mass. So your Endless Mass would obviously gather in, it will be able to inflict the additional 33% anomaly damage is going to be coming in to those enemies their way. On top of that, they've now got an additional 30% more damage coming in their way as well. You then land your Despair to be able to obviously inflict it even higher, and then your Impales land to be able to obviously hit even harder. And like I said, it depends on how this gets stacked, because if this works multiplicatively, then we're going to see some really nice numbers. But if it was just additionally to one of the additional anomaly damage that's going to be coming their way, then maybe it's not going to be as useful, or it's not going to be as useful as something like multi-strike. But that, once again, this is going to require some kind of testing to be able to see which one's definitely going to be better than the other. And I'm sure we're going to be able to find out within like the first week of this World Slayer dropping, and it's just going to become very. I have a feeling one's going to be obvious compared to the other, but we'll see as soon as that drops. And then lastly, you do have Energy Transmission, where each enemy damaged by your kinetic skill increases the damage of your seismic skill by 10%, and each enemy damaged by your seismic skill reduces ongoing cooldowns of your kinetic skills by 1 second. Now, the reason why this is potentially so good is because we're able to inflict so much debuffs in and around the battlefield, because we're able to consistently keep our debuff skills kind of like off cooldown. So what you could do is you can use things like Endless Mass to be able to grab a bunch of enemies, and obviously let's say theoretically you grab 4 enemies with Endless Mass. You grab those, you're now dealing an additional 40% on your next Impale, depending on how this stacks, or if it is able to stack, because obviously we're planning to, on our set rotation, to be able to use something like Gravity Leap to be able to hit those 4 enemies to be able to apply Despair. Is it going to stay at 40%, or is it going to jump all the way up to 80%, ready for our next Impale to actually land? Now, the main thing that's actually important with this is to be able to have, by the time we actually get to Impale, is to have our Gravity Leap and to have our Endless Mass down to to be in cooldown, basically. Because as soon as we activate our Impales, to be able to maximize how quickly we can get these back, every single enemy that then gets damaged by Impale is going to give you an additional second off of your cooldowns towards your Endless Mass and towards your Gravity Leap. So therefore, it's important to be able to have those on cooldown before you start your Impale, to be able to maximize getting those cooldowns back as quickly as possible. This means theoretically we can actually like start shaping the battlefield the way we want it with Endless Mass and with Gravity Leap to be able to start being a more effective debuffer, but obviously that's not for this build. The main debuff build will actually be for the Scorpion build, which we'll be looking at a later video. So the main thing to be able to take away from this is, while it does sound great on paper for actually being able to deal so much more damage, it's going to be interesting to see if Energy Transmission or Multi-Strike is actually going to be the more damaging kind of like mod. The only other downside is the fact that this doesn't help with Impale's cooldown, so therefore I'm a little bit worried, because Impale already is a kind of a slow cooldown kind of ability. Are we actually going to see this get any kind of like amendments in World Slayer? Are we actually going to see any kind of like other mods that are actually going to help us in that respect? Because as it currently stands, if we did actually go for Energy Transmission, that means we're going to be able to get our Gravity Leap and our Endless Mass back quite quickly, but are we actually going to see our Impale back just as quickly to be able to obviously trigger the rest of the skills? And as it currently stands, that's probably where it's going to fall down. It means that we'll probably get our like an additional cast of Endless Mass and get additional cast of Gravity Leap quite quickly, but then you'd have to wait until Impale comes back to be able to obviously do it all again. Now, in terms of Ascension points, obviously this is the last one to really cover, is the fact that this is going to be an anomaly power build. So therefore, we are going to focus primarily in that top left anomaly tree, which means that we're going to be primarily looking at anomaly power, resistance pierce, and then into our anomaly damage. Now, the main one to be able to probably go for would probably be resistance pierce, especially if you are rocking that unstoppable force mod, because that means that we're gaining additional damage straight through the enemy's defenses, but on top of that, we're also getting a bonus to our anomaly power, rather than just going straight for anomaly power, which is just going to be a flat anomaly power boost, and we still got to try and get through those defenses for the enemy. So therefore, I do think resistance pierce is probably going to be the main one to be able to go through first, and then as soon as that is done, go through and to anomaly power, and then grab anomaly damage, and that's already 30 points right there and then. Now, obviously, you can go for the standard stuff, which obviously means that we can have some health, we can have some armor, we can have some damage to elites, for example. But I do think that those are going to be the 3 main ones for the first 30 levels to be able to focus on, and then from there you can actually start expanding it a little bit further. So there you have it. That's pretty much everything that you need to know, or any kind of like build theorizing that we have around Vlad the Impaler. I hope you've learned something useful. Hopefully that gives you an idea as to how good this build potentially could be once World Slayer does actually drop. If you have any kind of amendments, or you actually maybe you disagree, or maybe you agree with some things that I've already said, let me know in the comment section down below. I'd be happy to hear and be able to discuss this a little bit further with you, because the sooner we actually have this information ready into hand before World Slayer actually does drop, the better position we're all going to be in when we actually get to be able to make those builds for us. So massive thank you for making it all the way to the end of this video. Massive thank you to the Babylonian family as always for their continued support. It really does mean the world to us. Make sure you have dropped a like and a subscribe, and that just leaves me to say keep yourself safe, keep yourselves well, and I'll see you all on our next video.